Welcome to Mountain Stream TV. I'm Avram Friedman, and we're here for another episode of the Community Services Forum. Today, we have with us John deVille, who is a retired teacher from Macon County, and the current manager, is that correct title?
Executive Director.
Executive Director of the Macon County Historical Museum.
That's right.
John, we've known each other for a long time, and I've always admired the work that you're doing. You're very active when you were a teacher in helping on issues related to teaching on the statewide level, and you're so knowledgeable. I hardly know where to begin, but please give us a little bit of background about your life, how you became a teacher and became involved as an activist on that level, and what led you to this point.
What led me to this point? Okay, so we'll see if we can get this in a 90-second soundbite here. So I was born and raised in Highlands, North Carolina, which is the resort town in Macon County, and in a lot of ways couldn't be more different from Franklin, where I've been for the last 30 years. But my mother was a public school teacher. My father owned and operated an Asian art gallery. That business was in existence for 59 years. And so I grew up in a small family business with a mother as a teacher, but really in a lot of ways both of my parents not only did they believe in education, I could show you newspaper articles where they were active in public education before I was born in Macon County, but they both constantly taught in an informal sense. And I went to school at UNC Chapel Hill, and I was a philosophy major there. And my mother had originally talked me out of becoming a public school teacher. She had had a bittersweet experience with it, and the bitter part of it, I think, was informing her thoughts at the time that we had a conversation where she was trying to steer me away from public education. And then, excuse me, in 1986, after struggling through one degree and still trying to figure out what I was going to do, because a philosophy degree doesn't really have a straight path to any particular vocation, I thought again about doing public education, and I finally went into it. My mom said, yeah, I probably should have, that's where your heart is. So I got the education over here at Western Carolina, and then I couldn't find a job where I wanted to live, so I did private sector work for a long time. I sold used cars. I did a lot. My biggest work was in mass market photography as both a photographer and a manager for 3 different corporations. And I finished that up. I was working in the Charlotte area, worked in Atlanta area, and then my last year, mass market photography was in Philadelphia. And I came back to Macon County in 1995, worked for my father, got a part-time gig teaching at Highlands School in the fall of 95, and then a full-time position opened for me at Franklin High School in January of 96. And I stayed there through November of last year.
What subject did you teach?
I taught, I was a social studies teacher, so I came in as a civics-only teacher, and I left primarily as a civics teacher, but the bulk of my instruction that I did was American history and philosophy.
That's civics. Tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me there's a woeful lack of understanding among the population about how the government works.
Right, and so and that's a common bleat. That's a common criticism. We don't. You'll see it over and over. We don't teach civics anymore. That's patently false. We do teach civics, but I think that disconnect and that gulf between what we might teach in a traditional civics class versus what an everyday understanding is. The reason for that chasm is because 80 days of instruction at the high school level is not going to overwhelm perceived secular realpolitik in terms of how things really work. So, there are three branches of government, but that would be news to not only the current administration, it would be news to Supreme Court judges, and we should, I think, correctly assume that nobody should know more about the Constitution than a Supreme Court justice. But if you have a Supreme Court justice or justices that believe in a unitary executive, and that's what's informing them, if you have a Supreme Court justice like Judge Kavanaugh who believes that racial profiling is okay to facilitate the endeavors of ICE and the Border Patrol, then I think it falls to reason, it stands to reason that everyday, ordinary folks would have perhaps a perverted and twisted sense of what the Constitution stands for and actually outlines.
Yeah, so you're saying that public policy as it's being carried out today unteaches civics.
Unteaches would be one, or it overwhelms it. There is a everyday waking hegemony of what happens versus what's taught in a civics classroom. And there's nothing that, you might try to teach realpolitik in a civics classroom, and there would be times that I would allow myself that affordance. But it's so that there's nothing in a civics book that says that Avram Friedman or John deVille can reach into their wallets and pull out $250 million and buy a presidency or a Senate seat or a House of Representatives seat. But we know that. There's nothing in a civics textbook that says that it's okay for a Supreme Court justice to take gifts in kind from people who are going to be standing before the court on a particular issue. But that happens on a regular basis. And maybe we should have a course in high school about that gap.
So that's what you're really talking about there is the corruption of government, not government as it's written in the Constitution and the laws and regulations that have been passed, but rather the corruption of those laws and regulations.
Well, I think corruption is certainly afoot, but I think that going back to the founding of the country under the Constitution, there has been a wink and a nod. So, and there's a disconnect between ideals and between practice. So we have in our sacred secular scripture, all men are created equal. But that right out of the gate is not operative in 1789 when we have our first presidential election, because maybe at the most 5% can vote. And we've had an unequal system for 250 years based on race, class, gender. That's always been there. And, we tried to teach that. I think we started to really lean into teaching that disconnect over the past 20, 25 years at both the high school level and certainly the last 40, 50 years at the collegiate level. And now those teachings are under assault. And teaching anything that has where systemic inequality exists, that is becoming more and more a forbidden topic.
What do you attribute that to?
Well, I think, let's look at what the high water mark is for equality, both racial and economic equality, and maybe gender equality in the United States. And so I think the high water mark for economic equality we find in the decades of the 50s and the 60s. I think for racial equality, we find that in the early 70s, but it almost starts to immediately decline in 1980. You can look at income inequality and that really takes off in 1980. So racial equality, there's this magic moment of the 70s, but then it's under assault. And the Voting Rights Act of 65, Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 68, those are the particular items that are under assault, not from people that I would call conservatives, but from people I would call reactionaries. And so as reactionaries feel more and more threatened, they feel that their privilege and their standing is more and more threatened, and they're able to coalesce around a particular focal point of restoring the United States to a place of status quo ante, and the anti-dividing line being 50s, 60s, and 70s. That's what I think that we're about right now, and have been really since 1980. In all of those high water marks, whether they are around racial equality, economic equality, or gender equality, have been under a very concerted assault for the past 45 years.
So bringing conversation back to the state of education in general and public education in general, I know you've been involved in the struggle to maintain the public education system as the primary place of education in American society. If you would, talk a little bit about how that is being threatened and what the dynamics are of that struggle.
Well, it's not being threatened anymore in 2025. I would say that the battle has happened and that the advocates for public education have lost. And I can envision anybody watching this throwing rotten fruit at the computer screen and saying that he doesn't know what he's talking about. But I would say look around. And then my follow-up question to somebody who would push back on the sentiments that I just uttered is, where do you see the ground on which to strike back? Where do you think you're going to get traction to undo what has happened, especially let's stay with North Carolina. How are we going to undo what's happened in North Carolina since January of 2011? Because starting in January in 2011, there's been an unmitigated assault on the K-12 structure. And so, I mean, the first part, when does it start? But you're going to have to help me again if you give me a prompt on where do you want me to go from that point. I mean, I think the war is over, and I think Philberger won.
And I guess where I want to go is you seem to be saying there's no hope for reversing that. I would dispute that just because I am.
I want you to.
Eternal.
To make a better,
not
better
an
viewing.
optimist, but as I'm a possibilist.
I believe in possibilities, and I can't remember where I heard this a week ago, but that was that despair is the greatest sin, and and hopelessness is. But I'm not totally full of despair, and I'm not hopeless. I just don't know if the public school classroom, as we have known it since the 1950s, if that's where the solution is going to be. Okay. And I don't know what the next thing. I mean, I'm a big fan of George Packer, who I would describe as a centrist social scientist and critic. And Packer wrote a book, 15 years ago now, called The Unwinding, and how political institutions that were created in this country right after World War II have just slowly fallen apart. And I think we can certainly see that in the two major political parties, that the Republican Party had atrophied And along came Donald Trump and the MAGA movement, and he took what was an empty husk of a party and rebranded it successfully, wildly successful. The Democrats are still trying to figure out, there's a massive identity crisis within the Democratic Party as to who the hell they are. But in terms of public education, in North Carolina, in order for it, here's the reason for my pessimism. And to me, perhaps, if I were going to put one thing up front, and maybe like the first thought and the last thought of what I wanted to say today, it's in some of the notes that I sent you, is this so-called hollowing out of America, the hollowing out of the middle class. So consider in North Carolina the two fastest growing job markets or income groups, and it's jobs that pay $25,000 a year and under. That's one fast growing group. And the other fast growing group is $80,000 a year or more. So that means that the jobs and economic opportunity between $25,000 and $80,000, those are disappearing, and we're becoming increasingly in have and have not. So my question is, for you or for anybody else, is where are the advocates? Because in my struggles, where are the advocates for retaining what we had in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and I would say up through 98. 98 is really the high water mark in terms of funding per pupil and teacher pay in North Carolina. And it kind of, is in this amorphous place from 99 to 2010, and then there's a pronounced decline. But I see that the parents that are left don't have the time bandwidth to advocate. They don't have the economic bandwidth to advocate. They don't know where the levers of power are. Okay, so So if I am an income earner between $30,000 and $50,000, as most people in Macon and Jackson, Swain, Haywood County are, how do I effectuate change? Where do I go? And what I have seen is more and more, and the lyrics I sent you this morning from Springsteen's Atlantic City, there's just winners and losers, and don't get caught on the wrong side of that line, that the parents who are able to advocate for their child, not their child's peer group. They advocate for their son, their daughter, which is perfectly understandable. So I want to make sure my son, my daughter, has Mr. Friedman for social studies rather than Mr. Jones, because Mr. Friedman really cares. Mr. Jones is a substitute who's 20 years old with a GED. Okay, so I want to advocate for that. And the other thing, I want to advocate for my kid to get more playing time in a better position on an athletic team, because that's what's important to me culturally, and maybe that's a way for my son or daughter to be able to pay for college education.
So I guess where my possibilism comes from, the source of my possibilism, is the historic reality that so often has happened in this country in our past, when seemingly powerless people overcame unimaginable obstacles to make social gains, such as when the women gained the right to vote. They didn't have anybody in Congress. They had absolutely no power. They didn't have economic power. They didn't have anything. What they had was people. And to emphasize the point you made, that this country, I believe you're right, has been taken over by the reactionaries, those who are on the extreme right, that really represent a small minority, relatively small minority, and there's an imbalance that exists right now that is unsustainable in that way, and that people, when they reach a certain level of oppression, tend to rise up. And when they do, it's extremely powerful, as we have witnessed even in the last few weeks with the No Kings rallies, just that dynamic of people gathering in the millions to express their opinion has enormous power outside of the political system itself, just in the nature of power. And so this is where I see the hope, and I think that in the education system, I don't have the knowledge and experience that you do in terms of the details, but I think that a great majority of people do not want to see Darwin removed from the curriculum, and really want their children to learn real science, real history, real civics, and that eventually the political pendulum will swing the other way, and with it, you ask who's out there doing the advocating. I do see politicians, some politicians, particularly in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, who are offering real solutions and are really trying to affect change. And so that's where I put my hope and my possibilism, just to answer that. Yeah.
Let me respond. So I think the analogy of the women's rights movement at the moment doesn't favorably compare to the public education situation. And the reason is that there were a tremendous number of women that saw themselves as allies. In the current political climate, people whose children are receiving a substandard education relative to 1998 do not see themselves necessarily as allies. They are looking at race, they're looking at economic and class, and then there is all the poison that has successfully been injected into the system for the last couple of decades. It existed prior to that, but the culture war issues have fractured the possibility of an alliance. So until we get past the culture war issues, I don't see an alliance happening. I think that's really important. In terms of, is there going to be a rock bottom and people can launch from there? That's certainly possible. I mean, I'll give you one one mark for your column. Excuse me. And that is starting to see people across a culture war spectrum to unify around opposition to Citizens United. That if maybe we can pull some of the super big money out of it, maybe we can have better healthcare policy.
I agree.
In particular, I think that's one other thing here about education. I think for too long in this state, and I've certainly been guilty of this, public education advocates have seen themselves as advocates for public education, and there's not been a good coalition across other issues. And I think especially important when public education advocacy groups, particularly NCAE, which is the biggest one, when we tied ourselves to landmine issues, culture war issues like access to abortion and social justice and equal rights for the LGBTQ community. When we did that, and I think it was morally the right thing to do, politically, I think it was naive, and it was counterproductive, and it allowed our opponents in the General Assembly to divide and conquer. We lost tremendous membership.
Public opinion has shifted.
Huh?
Public opinion has shifted on that. A majority of people now favor gay marriage.
It doesn't, but a majority does, but I don't know if you can win. Okay, again, a majority where? Okay, because we're not a majority of Americans. I would agree, but we are a gerrymandered state.
Right.
Okay, and it's a single state, and so all I've got to do is, at least 5 years ago, maybe the tide will turn in 2026, but all I've got to do is to drop on my political opponent is that Avram Friedman, all he cares about are transgender citizens. That's all he cares about, and all he other cares about are undocumented immigrants, and he doesn't care about real Americans. You put me in any rural district in North Carolina, and you take those positions on those social issues, and we're in rural North Carolina, I'm going to win. If I have that, and because that's, and again, that's not just an empty prognostication. That's electoral reality that's been reflected.
Well, 10 years ago, I don't believe that the people of Kansas would have passed by nearly 70% a vote on legalizing abortion.
Right.
In Kansas.
Right.
And in Idaho and in Missouri. So you see, there's
certainly
a very interesting conversation here about political.
Everything. It's all fluid. It's all
That's
fluid.
it.
It's all fluid. And so I agree with you. I mean, I think it is important to be a possibilist. I'm 100% with you. So but I do think if you're running for office, and I ran for office.
Yeah, I did too.
If you're running for office, you have to look at the landscape of the possibility right now. If you get too far ahead of where a block of voters are, you are not going to win.
Well, it depends on. It's not generally the Democrats who emphasize the issues of gender equality, and so this is what the Republicans prey on.
Right.
If that's the position you have on that issue. But Martin Luther King Jr. once said, and I think this is an important thing to consider even when you're running for office, in his letter from the Birmingham jail, he was told by the religious community around him that you're asking too much right now.
Right.
And his statement was, well, we're not thermometers here to measure the temperature. We're thermostats here to change the temperature. So running for office isn't necessarily, winning isn't in that election, first of all, is not the only goal. The goal is also to bring new ideas into the political arena.
And I think that's important.
And to motivate change by advocating for these issues on a rational basis.
And so let's go to Martin Luther King in 1964 Birmingham, because I taught that for 30 years. Yeah. I taught letter from Birmingham jail for 30 years. So there's two things there. One of which I think applies right now, and one maybe that it becomes more difficult. Martin Luther King understood television. He's one of the first people to really get it. As an activist. And so, there was a very specific reason that King goes to Birmingham. He goes to Birmingham because Bull Connor is there. And he knows that Bull Connor is going to show his ass. And Bull Connor obliged him and showed his ass. Now, the other thing that's going on in 1964 that tends to be left out of the civil rights story and the reason for the civil rights movement success is it's all under the umbrella of the Cold War. Okay, so
and the Vietnam War.
It's huge. Okay, so because the world in 1964 was divided into three ways. You had a communist bloc, you had a non-communist bloc, and then you had the non-aligned nations. Okay, now what did all the non-aligned nations have in common? They're all people of color. Okay, this is a melanated population that's up for grabs. And LBJ in the White House knows he's going to lose non-aligned nation battle. He's going to lose this global struggle for, and making sure that the world doesn't become under the umbrella of totalitarian communism. Okay, I have to do something. This is god awful, and he knows it's political suicide. He knows that the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act are both political suicide, but one, he wants to move the American marker forward in the Cold War, and secondly, he wants to out Kennedy. So it's I think we need to understand why certain things are successful in certain moments and why certain things aren't successful in certain moments, so that when we're looking to them for inspiration or guidance or a template for contemporary activism, we're learning the right lessons. Because if we pull those, if we not, it doesn't always work. So what would work in, I'll go for another 90 seconds and then I'll stop. I almost didn't run for school board. What my original plan was last year was to run for state senate in the primary and run as a Republican. Okay, I registered Republican. I did. I registered Republican in August of 24. And the reason for that,
strategy.
Well, the reason for it was because you have to be registered in a particular party for 90 days if you want to be on that ballot. Okay, so the plan was I was going to run against Kevin Corbin for state senate.
And my primary him.
I was going to primary him, and I was going to primary him as I had the whole strategy outlined. I was going to run as an Eisenhower, Ralph DeVille Republican. Because if you look at where the North Carolina Republican Party is, it's not conservative, it's thoroughly reactionary, it's not sustainable, to go to your point earlier, and it's inhumane and it's cruel. Okay? Eisenhower was not that. Eisenhower, we need to remember, was the President of the United States who sent the military into Little Rock, Arkansas, so that 10 black kids could go to Central High School in Little Rock. That's Eisenhower. By God, we're going to do the right thing. We're going to follow the rules of the Supreme Court. And he would have never countenanced, and my father would have never countenanced, and Republicans of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s would have never countenanced the voucher system and voucher program that North Carolina has. We will, this calendar year, spend over $600 million in totally non-accountable way. If Avram Friedman wants to take a rusted-out single-wide trailer and call it, Friends of Avram School, and you can take, with almost no oversight, the $4,500 a piece, and they could just sit there and watch cartoons all day. There's nothing. You don't have to be certified. Nobody's looking over your shoulder. How is that conservative? That was going to be my main argument. We're spending, and we are projected, we've already spent billions. We are projected to spend billions more, and we talk about means testing the Obamacare subsidies. We just lifted all income requirements in North Carolina for access to those vouchers. We started the voucher program 10 years ago. It was designed as a program for kids who were low income. We called them opportunity scholarships. We put aside a total of $10 million. It went from a program being for kids who were in really broken metropolitan school systems, and now it's grown to $600 million plus a year, no income requirements. How's that conservative?
What's the budget for the public schools?
I don't know what the budget for the public school is right now, but I can tell you this, okay, and this is important for anybody who's listening to this, and they're juxtaposing my remarks to the remarks of Senator Corbin, Representative Gillespie, or Mr. Clampett. because all of them will give you the same talking points. They will all tell you that we're spending more dollars than we ever have in public education, and they're right. But what they're not going to tell you are two things: that there's a lot more kids today than there were 20 years ago, and we've had this thing called inflation. So when they give their numbers, they never adjust it on a per pupil basis, and they never adjust it for inflation. So if you look at the graph, and I hope you put that graphic up when you cut the video, that shows where North Carolina is. I just sent it to you this morning. Okay, so you haven't had a chance to print that one out, but it shows where North Carolina is per pupil, and it's, depending on how you want to crunch it, we're 45th to 50th. Okay. Meanwhile, South Carolina has gone through the roof. I mean, South Carolina is really kicking it, and we're barely keeping up with Idaho, Utah, Louisiana. I mean, Alabama is going ahead of us. I would be paid more in Alabama this year than North Carolina, and way more in South Carolina. Here's the thing: South Carolina has a conservative governor and a conservative General Assembly that is way more amenable to the interests of public education. So, I mean, one thing we talk about a possible, we can all hope that Phil Berger loses his primary to the sheriff in Rockingham.
Oh, really? Okay.
This is the reason that we don't have a budget right now. We're the only state in the country right now that doesn't have a budget.
And so what's the sheriff of, he's a Republican also?
Oh, yeah, he's to the right of Berger, okay, but Berger did Donald Trump a solid, okay? He brought the General Assembly back and created one more congressional district, so we did one more little last-minute bit of gerrymandering, so we were able to bring the General Assembly back for that. We just don't have a budget. So school salaries and everything else are frozen. Meanwhile, starting next month in North Carolina, if you're a public school teacher, if you're any state employee, your premiums will go up based on what your pay is. Okay, your premiums are now going to be done on a. We've just the Republican Party of North Carolina has finally discovered progressive taxation, but it only applies to its employees. It doesn't apply to the millionaires and the billionaires.
This is a graphic you sent me. Jackson County, so far private schools in Jackson County have received $2,501,244.
Yeah.
This is over what period of time?
Well, that would be since it's the last 10 years, but the bulk, I can tell you that the bulk of that growth is the last 2 or 3 years.
So I'm going to hold that up so Ron can get a close-up of that.
And again, those voucher dollars,
Get it?
Those are primarily going to Christian schools, where the faculty and staff.
Yeah, I'm going to turn it over and you get the other side of that too.
Tend to be not all that well qualified.
Yeah.
So you can look and see what we're going to turn out there. You mentioned Darwin a second ago.
Yeah.
The Darwin fight left the station 20 years ago. We don't fight about, you hardly see any fights anywhere in the country over Darwin. What you see is what we're going to do. The fight is what we're going to say about slavery. That's where the fight is in
What are we going to
2025.
say? Well, I mean, I was using that obviously
Right,
as an
but
example.
but we shifted it. The big fights, we're in a science classroom, but now it's all in a social studies
again,
classroom.
I don't think a majority of people want to eliminate the mention of slavery in the classroom. But that's kind of what's being imposed on us. On us all.
Right. I would agree.
Yeah.
Do you know the effect of the voucher program on the education of the students who are going to those schools?
That's a very good question.
So let's repeat that question. What's the effect of the student of the voucher program on the students who are receiving those funds, or the schools that are receiving those funds?
I don't think that there's a monolithic one-size-fits-all answer. All I can do is I can look at them closing. I can look at them pushing kids out the door, and extrapolate from there. I think some of those kids are probably getting, especially at the lower grades, K, 1, 2, 3, probably in a lot of cases getting an okay education. It's when you get into 7th, 8th grade and high school where the content is far more difficult, that a lay person just can't waltz into a room and teach algebra well, or teach biology well, or teach American history well, or teach literary analysis well. So I don't have, to be fair, I don't have empirical data, and the thing is, nobody's got empirical data, and that's one of the problems. In other states in this country where they have a voucher program, those schools that accept that voucher money have to have regular standardized testing in most cases. North Carolina, there is zero oversight, both of faculty credentials and what the students are or are not doing.
So, so likewise, what's the impact on the public schools in terms of class size? Does it affect teachers' salaries? The number of teachers that are available?
Okay, so this is where it gets a bit tricky, but I don't think it's that tricky. So again, Senator Corbin, Mr. Clampett, Mr. Gillespie, they, in fact, Kevin's talking point is, quote, it's not binary. In other words, Kevin will tell you that $1 given to the vouchers doesn't mean that that's $1 taken away from public schools. Okay, if you want to bracket it off that way, I'm happy with that. What I can show you, though, is I can show you a voucher program that's gone from $10 million a year to $600, and I can show you that where per pupil spending for kids that are in a traditional public school classroom has gone from about 32nd, 34th in the country to 45th to 50th, and that teacher salaries have gone from around the low 30s, okay, to 48th. Okay, so I can't, while the argument that it's not binary might be an operative statement, we can see the voucher numbers have gone up, and adjusted for inflation, per pupil expending has gone down dramatically, and teacher salary position has gone down dramatically.
It's gone down when you're accounting for inflation. That's what I saw in one of the charts you sent.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
it's gone down tremendously.
It's gone down, and we've gone down in ranking with other states.
Right. We were number one in the Southeast, 1998. We were it. This is where the people came. This is what you benchmarked, was North Carolina. Prior to the Civil War, we were a benchmark. For the next 100 years, we'll be a benchmark in the South. And then we just pulled the plug.
And what is the strategy in doing that?
What's the motive or the strategy?
The motive.
The motive. I think the motive is that
is there somebody promoting these policies with a lot of money?
Well, I mean, sure. Okay, so I think you're asking a question you already know the answer to. So the John Locke Foundation, and Art Pope, they were the ones who, Art Pope funded a lot of candidates in 2011, and the John Locke Foundation, you can go read, State for Sale. It's the seminal article that comes out of the New Yorker, written by Jane Mayer, and how Jim Davis, who became a senator out of Franklin, how he got his money. So you had Art Pope money, you had the Koch brothers, and the Koch brothers had a very sharp strategy. Rather than trying to take over, Washington, D.C., they targeted certain state houses, and North Carolina was one of them. As to the why,
Source
if
of
you're
cheap
if you're
labor.
if you're yeah, you want cheap labor,
Yeah.
and if you look at what we've done in North Carolina, I mean, one of the reasons we don't have a budget right now is the whole plan is to get corporate taxes down to zero, and they have been doing this on a stair-step basis, and there's a schedule for it. The state Senate wants to accelerate that, and the House wants to slow that down a little bit. And then we went from progressive taxation to a two-tiered flat tax. So cheap labor would be, I think one reason that we want it. Now, I think also a more nefarious thing, but I can't point to where somebody said it, is you're defanging opposition. If you keep the electorate, relatively uneducated, uninformed, then it makes it easier to bamboozle. If you look at North Carolina's history in the 20th century, let's go back to this. So much of the Democratic Party's strength came from a symbiotic, synergistic relationship between public education at a K-12 level and a community college level and at a four-year college level. Those three sets of institutions were built by the North Carolina Democratic Party, were sustained by the North Carolina Democratic Party, and in return provided platforms and political power for the North Carolina Democratic Party. So when the Republicans took over office, took over the majority in 2011, what did they do? You start to defund K-12. The community colleges under the Republican regime have done okay. The four-year schools have been eviscerated and more scrutinized. So starting next month, if you're teaching any of the 16-member UNC school systems, Professor Smith, Professor Friedman here, you're going to have to turn in your syllabus for everything that you're teaching. In other words, you have to put a target on your back so some keyboard warrior in Silva can say, that Friedman guy, he's teaching Edward Abbey. Oh, no. No. He's teaching Rachel Carson. No. He's teaching that, acid rain is no. We can't have that. So, I think we've seen that happen.
But hadn't there been in the university system an influx of money, Koch brother money and other money, libertarian John Locke money, in exchange for introducing to the curriculum some of their literature and propaganda? That's
part of it. Part of it is to rewire the four-year university, and part of what's going on is rewiring a public school classroom. To what end, I don't know. I'll go back to the question Ron asked. Just because things are going badly doesn't mean that there's a malevolent motive behind it. It could be just simple incompetence. And I think a lot of what's going on right now is some relatively simple incompetence. And there's one other thing, and this is where a point where I think we could see some Republicans and Democrats come together. There are 116 school systems in this state. Okay, there are 116. There's 116 central office staffs. 116 superintendents. There's 116 bureaucracies. And all of them have got serious issues. Okay? They are, by design, almost places for feather bedding. It's a place to be comfortable. It's a place to hire my friends, my family, for jobs for which there's very little work, but the pay, especially compared to the classroom, is pretty remunerative. Making 55 grand, 58 grand in a classroom versus making 90 grand and not really having a lot to do with the central office. We've got a lot of that in the state of North Carolina.
These are in the boards of education?
The Board of Education is enabling, the various boards of education enable that, but it's the central offices that are, I would argue, bloated. If I were going to put on my conservative hat, that would be a place where I would shop. If I were a lawmaker in Raleigh, I would put limits that you can only spend X number of dollars. I would do it on a percentage basis. Okay, this is what you spend on the classroom. You can't spend any more than this on the central office.
On administration.
Yeah. It's because, now I've seen it get down to where it's scary. Macon County, there's a little bit of bloat, but not much. Jackson County, I think it's a similar situation. The metropolitan counties, the most egregious example is Forsyth County, and I don't know if you read what happened in Forsyth. Forsyth spent well over $100 million last year that they didn't have. Okay, yes. Yeah, okay, they're in deep trouble. So at the beginning in August, they had to fire like 350 people in Forsyth County because of an incredibly mismanaged central office. Just because you're in most school board members.
Winston-Salem, right?
Yes, Winston. Yeah. Most school board members are massively uninformed. They take take whatever the superintendent says as gospel, and they go on from that. But it's a very, very, very part-time position.
Okay. Let's see. We've touched on a lot, and I'm sure there's a lot more. This fascinating conversation, John.
Thank you.
Appreciate you. Let's touch on it because we're already going on over an hour here. Just want to give you an opportunity to talk a little about the museum and what that's about and what you do there.
So I am very fortunate. I left the classroom, I think, on November 15th of 25 or 24, and started working full-time at the museum on the 17th. I've been working there part-time about a month and a half prior. So the last couple of months of 24 were busy. I was teaching a full load. I was working part-time at the museum, and I was campaigning for school board. The Macon County Historical Museum is a true gem. So we're on Main Street across from the courthouse. We are in a building that went up in 1904. We're on the National Historic Deeds, Register of Deeds. It was a general store opened by the Pendergrass family, and they sold dry goods, clothing, student textbooks, and it's 2 floors of merchandise, and the family lived up on the 3rd floor, and they run it for several years, and they hand it off to their son and their daughter-in-law, who keep it as a general store into the early 70s. Very fortunate person. The Historical Society starts in Franklin, Macon County, around 47, 48, somewhere in that neighborhood, and doesn't really have a permanent place. There's no building. There's a retired teacher by the name of Jessie Sutton, and she had taught in Franklin, and she had created her own publishing company, publishing her own curriculum, and she had the vision to publish a history of Macon County and genealogical stories. And so they published in 1988 this 650-page book, and they pre-sold that, and they sold it for a lot of money. And the sales of that book, combined with the town co-signing the note, enabled the Historical Society to buy that Pendergrass store. And then we are crammed. I have thousands and thousands of items in that museum, and it's unlike any museum you've ever been in, and I've been in a lot. We don't have a lot of signage, but individual artifacts that are captivating, going from the Cherokee era we have Civil War, we have World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and then well over 50% of our displays are cultural things. There's musicians of Macon County, there's law enforcement officers of Macon County, there's a whole exhibit on important medical practitioners of Macon County, the Kelly sisters, one of which was one of the most important leaders in public education, not only in the state but in the country. Have stuff for them there, all kinds of items, and we're open every day except for Wednesday and Sunday, 9:30 to 4 o'clock. And if you come in, you can tell from right here I'm long-winded, but I have talks, free talks available pretty much on request for the history of Macon County, Civil War in Western North Carolina, and then the big presentation I'm working on that I'll present next July is the collision of Scot and Scotch-Irish culture running up against Cherokee culture, and charting that from 1670 to about 1838. So,
have you seen Ken Burns?
I've got it all recorded,
Revolutionary War.
and I am teaching a class. I can promo this. I teach free classes.
Oh.
Okay, and I teach them both in person at the museum and online. So you can do whichever format you want to do. So the one that starts in January, I'm doing the American Revolution next year. So the first half is it's Gordon Wood's. Is it Gordon Wood or the book is the radical ideology of the American Revolution. It's either Gordon Wood or Bernard Balin. And we start that in January. That goes January through May, and then I'll be doing the People's History of the American Revolution, which will run from August until December. So if you want to do that right there, you can shoot me an email at jdeville@gmail.com. The letter J, DEVILLE.
I'll put that up on the
Okay,
screen.
and then I will get you the information. I'll get you signed up, and again, it's free. And I've got about 35, all in now, about 40 people that split between the two classes, and most of them are over 55, and it's a spirited discussion that we have once a month for an hour and a half.
Do you have any other questions, Ron?
No, I don't.
Okay.
It's been very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank
John,
you.
I want to thank you for all
Thank
the
you
work
very
you've
much.
done
I really
and what
appreciate
you're
it.
doing now.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming.
All right. My pleasure.